Hello learners, welcome to this another session of your course BFDI 072 Basics of Pattern Making and Sewing. Today we will discuss the unit Steps for Garment Construction. So in the earlier session we have covered some of the topic of this particular unit. So in that session we discussed about fabrics, what fabric is. We discussed about how you will select a proper fabric for your design and what all preparations you will do for that before cutting of the fabric. We discussed about the layout, what layout is, and different types of layout we use for the cutting of the fabric, and we discussed about the marking and its technique. So in this session, we will discuss about the factors affecting the choice of seam type. We will discuss factors which determines the width of seam allowance. What are different characteristics of a well-constructed seam? We have to be very careful about that. And we will discuss the seam type for different fabrics. So let's start with the factors affecting the choice of seam type. So it is very important to understand what all factors are there which affects the choice of the seam type and how we will select a good seam according to demand of the design. So first factor which affects the choice of seam type is the type and the weight of fabric. So different seams are used for different kinds of fabric. Like we have already discussed, the stitch, the seam, the needle, thread, everything is related to the type of fabric which we are using for the construction of garment. So different type of seams are used for different kinds of fabrics we have, such as lightweight fabric, heavyweight fabric, and the sheer fabrics and the opaque fabrics we have. So choice of fabric depends on many factors like whether the fabric reveals excessively or the little or not. So what kind of texture does it have? Whether it has the rough surface or the rough texture, or it has the smooth texture. According to that, we select the type of seam for this construction. So the inner construction of sheer fabrics must be neat because it shows through from the right side of the fabric. Like when we have a fabric which is transparent, or we can from a garment which is made from sheer fabric, if it is not used the right type of the seam, from the side seam you can see the stitches of the garment. So if that type of fabric you are using for the construction of garment, we have to focus on the neatness of the seam and we have to choose the seam type accordingly. Then usually French seam, we have different categories of seam which we have discussed. So usually the French seam is used for the sheer fabrics or the fabric which is little transparent. Seams should be narrow and according to the design of the garment which we are constructing. So the self-enclosed seams like the French seam can be used for the lightweight to the medium weight fabrics, while when we are using the bulky or the heavyweight fabrics require a very simple seam that do not add any further bulk or extra margin to the fabric. So in that we generally use the plain seam for that. Then the second factor which affects the seam choice is the type of garment. Like it totally depends upon the type of garment which we are constructing. So this include the garment design, like for example whether the garment requires top stitching or not. Well, it all depends upon the design type. So the amount and the kind of wear, like whether it is for a one-time wear or it is the type of garment which is to be actively wear, and the care the garment will receive also determines the choice of seam. For example, the kids wear garment should have stronger seams like French seam and the flat fill seam type we can use for the kids wear garment. And the seam on the sports wear should be durable and strong because they have to take lots of wear. So we have to choose the seam type which is durable and strong at the time. So for that we use the flat fill seam. Then the next factor is seam position, like where the seam to be developed. So this means the placement or the position of the seam in the garment, like whether or not the seam will be seen. Like if it is on the side seam, we have and the fabric is sheer, so we use the French seam, so make a neatness or the finish on the garment. And a fully lined or an unlined garment will require different seam finishes, like according to if the lining is there, unlined is there, we have to opt for the seam which gives the finishes. So an underlined garment will require well finished seam as they will be visible from the right side. So on the other hand, a lined garment can have a plain seam as they will not covered with the lining. So these are the certain factors which affect the choice of seam type. Then what are the different factors determining the width of a seam allowance? Like we have discussed about the seam allowance, like where what amount of seam allowance we have to give in our pattern. So what are different factors which affects the which we defined on which the width of the seam allowance is dependent. First is the type and the width of the fabric. Like the fabric structure and the thickness will determine the width of the seam allowance we opt for that particular fabric. So the thick or the heavyweight fabric, we use the seam allowance should be less to avoid the excessive bulk. Like if we are using the fabric which is heavyweight and we have the seam allowance of 1 inch or more than 1 inch, it will create lots of bulk in that particular garment. So to avoid, we should use the seam allowance according to the type of fabric and the weight of the fabric. Like if the fabric is heavyweight, we should have less seam allowance in that. Then medium to lightweight fabric can have more seam allowance as compared to the heavyweight fabric. And the fabric structure, like a loosely woven material should have more seam allowance than a firmly woven material. So as it has a tendency to fray, like the medium weight fabric or the lightweight fabric or a fabric which is very loosely woven. So it is possible that it can fray very easily. The threads can come out very easily. So we should give a proper seam allowance to that particular type of fabrics. Then second factor is the type of garment. Like what type of garment we are constructing is also on that also the seam allowance depends. The end use of the garment also determines the seam allowance. So like if the garment is close fitted, the seam allowance should be small or it will be uncomfortable for the wearer. Like suppose we have an example of a blouse. This blouse is a garment which is very close fitted, and if we give extra seam allowance to that, it will not feel, the person who is wearing that will not feel comfortable because it will create lot of bulk. So a loose fitted garment may have a wider seam allowance. So third type of factor is the type of seam. Type of seam, like different seam types require different amount of seam allowance. For example, the seam allowance for French seam will be different as compared to the flat weld seam. So according to that, we choose the seam allowance. Next is the seam position. Seam position means the width of a seam allowance, and it varies depending on its location, like where it is located in the garment. Like the straight seam, like the side seam or the shoulder seam have more seam allowance as compared to the curved part of the garment, like the neckline or the armhole. Like on the side seam or the shoulder seam, we have more seam allowance, but in the neckline or the armhole, we keep the seam allowance very least. So the deeper the curve, the lesser will be the seam allowance. So these are the certain factors which affect the choice of the seam allowance. Then the characteristic of the well constructed seam. How you will judge that this particular seam is a well constructed seam and it should be used for the construction of garment. So a properly constructed seam should have adequate strength and good appearance. The most important thing or the characteristic which we see in a good constructed seam is the strength and the good appearance. Strength means the strength also depends upon the seam type, like which type of seam we are using for the construction. The strength depends on that. Like French seam is stronger than the plain seam, and it is made by durable double row of the stitching. So this is how we can develop a strength by using different types of seam in the garment construction. Then we have the stitch density or stitch per inch, like how many number of stitches are there in 1 inch of stitch, or what is the density of that stitch. Like the more the stitches per inch, the stronger will be the seam, and after a certain limit of when we are constructing a seam, the seam strength decreases with the increase of stitch per inch. Like as the increased stitch per inch cause distortion in the structure of the material, and it weakens the stitch of the garment. So the thread type, the quality of the sewing thread which we are using for construction, it also affects the seam strength. Like if we are not using the good quality of thread for construction of seam, we will have the strength of the seam will be weaker. So we have to choose the thread type according to the fabric which we are using and the type of stitch we are developing. Then the appearance of the seam. So appearance of the stitch or seam depends on the proper relationship between the needle size, type of thread and the stitch length in accordance with the material being used. Like everything is related like to the fabric. Like it all depends the type, size of the needle, type of the thread and the stitch length. It all depends upon the fabric or the material which we are using for stitching purpose. So we should be very careful, and a proper selection of a needle, thread and stitch length according to the fabric is most important thing, and we should keep in mind when we have selected the fabric. We should first select the needle, thread and the type of stitch according to that particular fabric only. So these were some certain characteristics we discussed where we see in a good constructed seam. Then there are different types of seams for different fabrics. Let us see what different types of seam we have and for which type of fabric it is used. First is the plain seam. Plain seam we have we generally use this for fine to medium weight fabric that frays very easily. So first, there are different seams in the category of plain seam. First is the stitched and pinked edges. Like we use it for the fine to medium weight fabric that frays very easily, and we use it for to make the fabric or the garment neat, and we generally use it on the leather goods. Then in the plain seam we also have the turned and stitched edges, and this particular type of plain seam we use for the fine to medium weight fabric like cotton, linen, viscose, and this gives the garment a neat finish, hard weaving, and the good for the fabric which is frequently washed. Like for the daily wear or the casual wear garments, we use this type of stitching. And it is done on the straight seams, like the side seam or the shoulders, we generally use this type of seam. Then we have the bias bound edges. Bias bound edges we generally use for the thick fabric that frays. Like it gives or provides neat finish on the neckline and the armholes. Like we cannot have the straight stitching or the neckline or the curved part of the garment. So we use the bias bound edges. So it gives the finish to the neckline or the armholes and expensive finish to the garment. So done on the seam of the unlined jackets also, we use the bias bound edges. Then we have the overlocked edges. Overlocked edges we generally use for the fabric. Most of the fabric we use the overlock edges, and it gives or it is used for all the fabric, whether it is thin or the lightweight or the heavyweight, and this is one of the cheapest type of finished seam we use in the garment construction. Then the second type of seam we use in the construction of garment is the French seam. French seam we generally use, as we discussed also, if we use for the sheer thin fabric, very fine fabrics like chiffon, georgette, silk, voile, and that type of fabrics. So generally we use it for the blouses and the children wears or the kids wear garment. Then next type of seam we use is the flat fill seam. Flat fill seam we generally use for the fabric which have to wear lots of wear or to be which are used very much, like the denim, cotton, silk, polycotton, or the linen. So when you see your jeans, that on we have the flat fill seam. So the jeans, shirt, nightwear garment require this, which requires a frequent washing. We use the flat fill seam. Then we have the welt seam, which we use for the medium to heavyweight fabrics like the denim, linen, wool, and the tweed. And it is also used for the tailored garment style. For extra ornamentation, we also use this type of seam for the seam on the skirt, dresses, trousers, coat, and jackets. This particular welt seam we use in the construction of this garment. So, learners, we discussed about what different types of seam we use for different types of fabric. So, in this session, we discussed various factors which affect the choice of seam type. What are different factors like the type of the fabric, weight of the fabric, what type of garment we are constructing. So, what factors affect the choice of seam type? What are different factors which affect the width of the seam, allowance we use in the garment construction, and we discussed different characteristics of a well-finished seam. And we also explained what different types of seams are there according to the type of fabric we use for the garment construction. So in this, it's all about the Unit 8 steps for garment construction. Hope this session will be beneficial for you. Thank you.